Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents 142 Ostriches by April Dávila. Read by Sarah Mollo-Christensen. If I were to leave this desert, who would cherish transparent light? Who would nurse broken stones? Who would mother the cold? Richard Shelton. 1. 4 days before the ostriches stopped laying eggs, Grandma Helen died in an accident that wasn't really an accident. It was a Sunday, when almost everyone was in church, when the only other trucks on Route 66 were bigger than hers, their immense grills roaring toward her, then escaping one after another, until a tomato trailer out of Sacramento proved too enticing. She had nowhere to be, no appointment to keep, no need that would require a drive through the heat of the Mojave in July. She hadn't called up the stairs to ask if I needed anything from town. The last thing I heard of her was the rasp of her keys as she scooped them from the counter, the bang of the screen door as she left. Then nothing, until the phone rang hours later.
Tallulah?
The deep voice on the other end of the line hesitated.
It's Sheriff Morris. I hate to tell you this over the phone,
he said,
but I wanted you to hear it from me.
And I knew. Just like that. In my mind, I could see Grandma Helen's thick hands urging her pickup over the double yellow lines of the narrow highway. I felt the perfect silence that filled the cab, the way time slowed down in the moments before everything exploded in twisted metal.
You all right?
The afternoon light drifted in through faded yellow curtains. The tawny tile of the kitchen countertops gleamed. Yeah, I said. No. Thank you for calling. I hung up. The walls of the small kitchen pressed in around me. My chest ached. I pushed through the front door and sank onto the steps overlooking the rolling expanse of desert. The hot, dry air outside burned my throat and seared my lips. In the corral, the ostriches strolled past one another, their long, meaty legs unfolding with each graceful stride. Our old border collie, Henley, trotted by on his way to his favorite cool spot in the barn. The leaves of the walnut tree whispered in a faint, hot breeze. And still, she was gone. How strange that one phone call from a man I barely knew could all but erase my grandmother from my life. I half expected her to emerge from the barn, rubbing at the crease between her eyebrows with her knuckle and grumbling about mice in the food stores. But she didn't. The sun crept toward the violet crags of the San Gabriel Mountains in the west. The light tilted and shadows stretched. Eventually, my Aunt Christine's minivan came up the half-mile of gravel that was our driveway and parked in the shade of the walnut tree. 8 months pregnant, she slid down from the driver's seat the way honey falls from a spoon. She gripped the frame of the van until she was steady on her feet, then turned to me with her arms wide. "Tallulah, sweetheart." She wore a draping dress with pale pink flowers on it, the fabric stretched taut over her belly. I let her envelop me in a hug. Tears rolled down my cheeks. She patted my back. "It's okay," she said, though we both knew it wasn't. She put her arm around my waist and marched me into the kitchen, where she filled the kettle with water. The weather was far too hot for tea, but the chill of the air conditioning indoors seemed to make space for it, and the death of the family matriarch called for chamomile. Aunt Christine moved with utter assuredness, as if the news of Grandma Helen's death had come with a set of instructions. Sipping our tea at the kitchen table, the two of us could have passed for sisters. She was only 6 years older than me. A surprise baby, born after Grandma Helen thought her years of childbearing were over. I had been a less welcome surprise, conceived before my mom even finished high school. My hair hung longer than Aunt Christine's, bleached a brighter blonde by the sun, and my skin held a deeper tan for the same reason. But the oval shape of our faces, the thin lips, the arching, nearly invisible eyebrows, in those ways, we were almost identical. She pulled the tea bag from her mug and dropped it in the trash, leaning over her belly to see that it landed true. Still moving with that sense of purpose, she rummaged around until she found Grandma Helen's address book, an ancient thing with a row of gold letters on little black tabs. She flipped to the D tab, marked her place with a manicured finger, and dialed. "Lizzie," she said, "it's Christine, Helen's daughter. I'm afraid I have some sad news. There's been an accident." Her voice cracked a little as she explained, repeating what the sheriff had told me. I stared at the untouched mug, growing cold in my hands, and listened as she called a dozen people, explaining over and over about the accident. I grew more skeptical every time I heard that word. Grandma Helen had convinced me, after I graduated from Victorville High, not to go off to college like my friends. She even gave me a small raise for my work on the ranch, and at first I gloated about making money while all my friends took on debt. But as time went by, and I saw online that they were making their way in the world while I continued to do the same shit I'd done for years, I got antsy. I applied for a job with the Forest Service, but didn't say anything about it to Grandma Helen. Not until they asked me to come in for an interview. When I did break the news, she dropped her fork mid-meal and left the room. We didn't even argue. I cleaned her plate along with mine and reminded myself that I'd known she would be upset. It would pass. Her objections ticked up a notch after I passed the physical exam for the job. She stubbornly insisted that she needed me on the ranch. When I argued she could hire someone to do my job, and for less, she grew sullen, hardly speaking to me for days. It wasn't until my final acceptance letter arrived, telling me I'd been temporarily assigned to a fire prevention hand crew in Montana, that her anger boiled to the surface and we argued about it. And the very next day, there I was, sipping tea and listening to my aunt inform everyone of the accident that had taken Grandma Helen's life. Accident my ass. She had wanted me to stay, and when I said no, she put everything in my hands and bailed, knowing I was the only one who could run the ranch in her absence. It was a dirty trick. 3 days passed in a flurry of activity. I kept my head down and my opinions to myself through meetings with the funeral director and with Grandma Helen's lawyer. No one was terribly surprised to learn that she'd left the ranch to me. None of her 3 children had any interest in it. Still, everything had to be made official. Paperwork had to be signed, and local acquaintances needed to know when and where we would be mourning, as if these things followed a schedule. While Aunt Christine arranged everything, I struggled to keep up with the work on the ranch by myself. The flock could lay dozens of eggs every day in the hot summer months of the peak season. Each egg had to be collected, washed, polished, and stacked in cold storage for eventual shipping out to specialty grocery stores all over the country. Without Grandma Helen, it was difficult to keep up. It used to be that we had a routine. Grandma Helen would lure a hen off her nest with a handful of grain while I swiped the eggs and loaded them into the wheelbarrow, and then we prepped them for shipping together. Now I had to do it all myself, and it was even harder than I had anticipated. The 3rd morning after Grandma Helen's supposed accident, I parked the wheelbarrow next to one of the nests and dug some grain from a zippered pouch on my belt. I clicked my tongue the way Grandma Helen always did, and the dust-colored hen lifted her head toward me, her big eyes focused on my cupped hand. She reached with her serpentine neck, and I pulled away. Ostrich nests aren't like the nests of smaller birds, with twigs and grass like a finch would build. An ostrich nest is simply a circular indentation in the sand with a ridge pushed up around it to keep the eggs from rolling away. The hen leaned side to side to get her legs under her and rose up, a feathered balloon, revealing 3 eggs the size of footballs. Soft dust clung to the creamy white shells. She strode toward me, and I retreated. When she cleared the nest, I dropped the grain and rushed to collect the eggs, but I was only able to grab one before the hen returned and snapped at me, giving my arm a sharp pinch before she settled down onto the 2 remaining eggs. I cursed, shaking my arm against the pain, and began again. It took me 8 frustrating hours to do a chore that would have taken 2 with Grandma Helen. At the end of the day, I stormed into the house with my arms covered in red welts and flopped into a chair at the kitchen table. It was stupid, trying to run the ranch on my own. Aunt Christine had taken over the kitchen to prepare for the funeral reception that would bring everyone to the house the next day. She set paper napkins in tidy piles on either end of the table and wiped down counters. "Don't touch anything," she said. "I'll get you something to eat." She opened the refrigerator a crack and held up both hands to keep the foil trays of lasagna and spaghetti from falling out. Ever since news got out about the accident, people I hardly knew had been showing up on my doorstep with offerings of pastas and casseroles. Aunt Christine's church friends, mostly. She slid a plate across the table to me. Linguine in a pine green pesto sauce. My hunger hadn't registered until I took the first salty bite. My mood lightened a little as the food filled my stomach, but my arms continued to throb where the birds had nipped at me. While Aunt Christine was pulling mugs from the cupboard and stacking them near the coffee pot, I dragged Grandma Helen's address book across the table and flipped to J. The first entry was for Joe Jared of the J.J. Ostrich operation out of Yuma. I stared down at the name, written in my grandmother's elegant cursive, tall and sloped to the right. Joe Jared had been salivating over the ranch for decades. With our land, he could increase his production by 50% while lowering his delivery costs to his primary market in Las Vegas. Every few years, he sent a purchase offer that Grandma Helen rejected without even reading. I didn't have to be stuck on the ranch, no matter what Grandma Helen had thought. There was one more card I could play. But even thinking of selling brought on guilt. If Grandma Helen had wanted the ranch sold off, the money evenly distributed among her children and grandchildren, she would have said so in her will. She'd left it to me because I could do the work. I knew how to manage the birds and was familiar enough with the billing that I could figure it out. She trusted that I would carry on with the business. Aunt Christine continued to bustle around the kitchen, arranging plastic forks and spoons upright in cups on the counter, little bouquets of disposable flatware. I let my finger trace down the page of the address book. Below the entry for Joe Jared, the page was a smudged mess dedicated to my mom. The first entry for Laura Jones was logged in ink. The address, some crappy apartment in Hollywood, was scratched out with 3 efficient blue lines. In the margin was my name, with my birthday written in tiny print underneath. The next entry was in pencil, erased and rewritten so many times that the page had developed a small hole, and my grandmother had been forced to use a third entry for my mother. This one had also been erased and rewritten so many times that it would be worn through soon. I wasn't even sure if the Oakland address we had for my mom was current. Usually she called to let us know when she moved, but sometimes it took her a while. Over the years, her cell phone number had become the most reliable thing about her. "You called to tell her about tomorrow, right?" my aunt asked. She had come up behind me without my noticing. I startled and flipped shut the address book. "Yeah," I said. When I'd called my mom, she had sounded upset, but not devastated. Her exact words were, "Oh, shit." She dutifully took down the address of the church where the funeral would be held and said she would come. It was the same, well, these things happen, attitude that everyone had, and I wanted to scream at them all. Grandma Helen had had a full life, yes, but it wasn't supposed to be over. She had checked out and abandoned us all. No one understood that but me. Aunt Christine plucked her oversized purse from the kitchen table and slung the strap over her shoulder. "I'll pick you up at 10. Please be ready." "Uh-huh," I said absent-mindedly, opening the address book again after Aunt Christine wedged herself out the front door. As soon as I heard her engine cough to life, I dialed Joe Jared's number.
"Helen Jones,"
he said when he answered, apparently reading off his caller ID. His voice came through with such force that I recoiled from the receiver, a tickle boring deep inside my ear. "No," I said, bringing the phone closer so I could speak. "It's her granddaughter, Tallulah." We had never met. I felt cold, but my palm was sweating against the receiver. "Are you still interested in buying our ranch?" I was taking that job in Montana. 2. The next morning, I got up early to collect as many eggs as I could before the funeral. Joe Jared had been excited to get my phone call, but until all the details of the sale were worked out, the chores that made up my daily life on the ranch would need to be attended to. The sky hung heavy with the scent of a coming storm. Rain was a rare and welcome thing in the desert. Soon, the low clouds would open up as if sliced from below with a blade. A deluge would fall for an hour, maybe 2, soaking the parched land and setting everything to sparkle. I loved rainy days. Everybody did. Giddy children would dance in the streets with their heads thrown back, and the adults would gather in grateful clusters to agree on how much we needed the water. Nobody owned an umbrella. Wrestling the wheelbarrow from the barn, I shoved it through the sand to the center of the corral. The metal grate at the base of the elevated grain silo came open with a clunk, and the ostriches all swiveled their heads. The bird feed slid down a metal sluice into the trough below, and the birds gravitated toward their breakfast. I ducked out of the way, daydreaming about Montana, where I wouldn't spend my days being pecked at by aggressive birds that outweighed me by 200 pounds. Up and down my arms, the welts they'd given me held every shade of bruise. I planned to collect the eggs while the ostriches were preoccupied with their meal, hoping to avoid as many nips as possible. But as they rose to their feet, I saw that the nests were all empty. All except one, in which a solitary egg rested on its side. Confused, I scooped it from the nest. It was warm and had a good weight to it. I scanned the floor of the corral for the distinct white curves of the eggs, but there were none, except the one in my hand. I cradled the egg in my arm and walked the full length of the corral, taking in one empty nest after another. The sandy rings looked like little blast marks left in the wake of some bloodless battle. Over at the feed trough, the birds reached past one another with their long necks to poke at the grain below with quick, deliberate jabs, the way my aunt would check the temperature of a pan by tapping at it. Outwardly, everything was as expected. From the far end of the corral, I watched as the birds finished eating and drifted away from the empty feed trough, dispersing into the corral. The hens loped to their nests and settled their desert-brown bodies precisely as they did every day. There was nothing unusual about the birds. In fact, once the hens sat down, hiding their empty nests, I almost doubted myself. But the weight of that one single egg told me I wasn't imagining things. My thoughts went immediately to the conversation I'd had with Joe Jared the night before. He had been eager to move ahead with the purchase of the ranch, but I had no doubt he would back out of the deal if something was wrong with the ostriches. Not that he cared about the eggs as a product. He ran a meat and leather operation, hatching the eggs and raising the chicks for slaughter. But he needed eggs all the same. Can't run an ostrich ranch without ostrich eggs. Still carrying the one egg in the crook of my arm, I took hold of the beak of a nearby female to check for signs of sickness. Her feathers fluffed in protest, and she shifted on her nest, but I held firm, and she allowed me to pull her face close to inspect for congestion or sticky eyes or anything that might signal a sickness of any kind. There was nothing. I checked one of the males, too, but by all outward appearances they were in perfect health. I climbed up the feed silo ladder to inspect the grain for rot, thinking maybe the lack of eggs was due to a problem with the bird's food. But there was nothing wrong there. I even took a sip from their water trough, testing for a bitter taste or funny smell. The water was cool and clean. Of course, I knew there were things I wouldn't be able to detect, but subtle toxins would take time to do damage. I couldn't explain the sudden stop of egg production over one night. It didn't make sense. Nothing appeared amiss. Nothing except the lack of eggs. I was still trying to figure it out when I saw my aunt's minivan approaching. I delivered the lone egg to the cold storage unit and hurried inside to change. At the beep of Aunt Christine's horn, I emerged in a recently purchased black cotton sack of a dress that was too tight in the shoulders but mercifully covered the bruises on my arms. I climbed into the passenger seat. Aunt Christine wore an elegant black maternity dress with a satin V-neck. She gave my dirty boots a sideways glance, but said nothing. My cousins sat subdued in the 2 rows of seats behind me, clad in matching black dresses. The oldest had been a baby when I came to live on the ranch, the center of attention in every room. Then, just as she took her first steps, the second was born, then the third, fourth, and fifth, dividing the family's adoration until they ceased to be individuals and became simply the girls. 5 babies seemed like plenty to me. But then, after a gap of several years, Aunt Christine announced that God had seen fit to bless their family once again. Another girl. My aunt, burdened with the weight of that 6th pregnancy, leaned into the steering wheel with determination. It was a miracle she could even reach the pedals, considering how far she'd put her seat back to accommodate her extended middle. She threw the minivan into gear. "After the service," she said, the van rumbling over the graveled drive, "I need you to collect the photo of your grandma. I had it framed. I'll collect the flowers and the urn." Her energy for funeral planning was impressive, but that was what Aunt Christine did. She took care of things. She was good at it. I gave a worried backward glance at my birds as we drove away from the property, wondering again at the lack of eggs, and nursing a hope that the empty nests were a fluke. In the distance, the tips of the mountains scraped a gray ceiling. The minivan zipped along under the somber sky. Aunt Christine counted off the people she expected to attend the reception at the ranch, grouping them by family. "That's 9 cars," she said. "I told them all to park against the corral fence so we don't block anyone in. Hopefully this rain will hold off until we get everyone inside." She leaned forward, straining over her belly to peer up at the sky through the windshield. "I've got coffee set to brew, and a couple of the ladies from the church will make sure folks get enough to eat." She glanced over at me. "All you have to do is smile and be polite." "I can be polite," I said. On our left, PFX Cement rose up out of the earth with its 5 industrial silos and 3 enormous geodesic domes. A twisted tower of massive tubing climbed twice as tall as the silos, surrounded by scaffolding that never came down but somehow managed to appear temporary. My boyfriend worked for the company, but had traded in a vacation day to join me at the funeral. "Devin coming?" Aunt Christine asked, as if reading my thoughts. I nodded. Devin brought a welcome balance to Aunt Christine's structured tension. It was comforting to know that he would be at the church. We came to Sombra and breezed through the only stoplight, continuing on into the expansive desert surrounding the small town. Eventually, the scrappy desert brush and rolling hills gave way to the tract homes and strip malls of Victorville. The sky was holding when we arrived at the high desert oasis United Church of Christ, but I could smell water on the wind, feel it on my face and arms. As we crossed the parking lot toward the massive cement block of a building, I surveyed the collection of cars, wondering if one of them was my mom's. Last I knew, she had a beat-up black Integra, but that had been 11 years ago. I had no idea anymore what kind of car she drove. We passed a Subaru with a bumper sticker from Redwood National Park. I tried to conjure an image of her camping up near Willits or Ukiah. Seemed unlikely, but no more so than her driving the Ford pickup parked next in line, reporting every day to some respectable job and collecting a steady paycheck. The truth was, I had no idea who my mom was anymore. After 11 years, how could I? Odds were she hadn't changed much. She probably still worked nights at some bar and slept all day. Or maybe she'd finally taken those online classes she always talked about and was working as some kind of an administrator in an office building in downtown Oakland. A paralegal, maybe. We passed a Mercedes, and I tried to picture her driving it, her blonde dreadlocks wrapped up in a bun on top of her head, but I couldn't keep a straight face. Then again, none of Grandma Helen's acquaintances drove such a nice car. I sobered and prepared myself for whoever we might find inside the church. The double doors facing the parking lot hung open despite the threatening weather. Aunt Christine, the girls, and I followed the center aisle and emerged from under a deep balcony. It was an ugly, cavernous church. I had attended each of my cousin's baptisms there, and every time I noted the stoic lack of beauty, the aggressive scent of industrial cleaning products that never seemed to dissipate. The place was covered, floor, walls, and ceiling, in an oatmeal-colored fabric. The only natural light floated in through one large, circular window above a stark metal cross. No stained glass, no structural details. I thought how I would joke later with Grandma Helen about how tacky the place was, but then, just as quickly, realized I wouldn't. The 30 or so people who had taken the morning off to pay their respects didn't fill the first 2 rows of pews. The giant stage could fit 300 people easy, and I could envision a giant choir singing, arms raised. But on that day it was empty, except for a small table covered in white lace. On it rested a wooden urn between a vase of lilies and a framed photo of my grandmother. I hovered beside Aunt Christine as she greeted friends in hushed voices. A round woman with short curly hair and glasses took my hand. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said. I recognized her but didn't know her name. She had brought a lasagna out to the house, big enough to feed 12 people. "Thank you," I said, grateful when another approaching well-wisher, a middle-aged man with a wiry beard, compelled her to move along, sparing me from any small talk.
"I'm sorry for your loss," he said.
I looked past him to scan the faces in the room. None were my mom. I wondered if I would miss any of these people when I was gone. My aunt was sweet but overbearing about the way she wanted things done. As for the rest of the people gathered there, I hardly knew them. acquaintances of my grandmother, friends of my aunt. Aunt Christine's husband, Todd,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?